Great. So, good afternoon, everyone. This is the finance panel, in a way, and so we were wondering whether anyone would be in the audience, but fortunately, you've all recognized that in some ways this is the make or break topic about whether we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, because if you look at all the forecasts that are out there, basically somewhere between $3.5 or $6 trillion a year needs to be added to what is being spent and invested in achieving those goals if they're to be achieved. And with this panel, we have three pioneering women in this field of actually figuring out how to finance those goals. And they're going to tell us about some of the exciting things that are happening at the moment, but also what some of the challenges are that will need to be overcome if this is to really scale up and achieve the kind of impact necessary to actually achieve the goals. So on the far end, we have Safeena Husain, who's founder of Educate Girls, which is a pretty much self-explanatory, and operates in India. Next to her is Georgie Bernadette, who runs Align 17, which is a new organization that's really trying to literally mobilize funds to achieve the 17 SDGs. And then next to me is Maya Cheringol, who is really the driving force behind the RISE fund, which is a $2 billion private equity fund leading the mainstreaming of impact investing. But she has a long history in impact investing before she joined TPG, which is the private equity firm that does that. So I wanted to really start with Georgie, as you've got this big focus across all the 17 goals. You know, what do you think needs to be done to really mobilize that massive extra amount of funding and particularly private sector funding to achieve the goals?
Yeah, so thank you, Matthew. And indeed, right now we need to pay the bill effectively for the global goals, and it's at the tune of $5 to $7 trillion a year. So obviously, we cannot do it by ours alone. It cannot happen just from the development sector or the government, and we need all hands on deck. So Align 17 was founded by a group of founding partners, including UBS, PwC, and one of the largest asset managers, Hamilton Lane. And the idea is to mobilize the private wealth from ultra-high net worth individuals, which is in the world right now, just to have an idea, there's around $18 trillion in private wealth. How do we mobilize that capital into impactful, vetted, co-investment, direct deals? So it's a different asset class than private equity, which is Maya does. It actually gives access to these investors to direct deals alongside the likes of the IFC, the Global Innovation Fund, the Calvert Foundation, people who have in their mission to mobilize different sources of capital into impact, and they allocate a portion of their investments to these private wealth advisors and individuals who want to have more connection to where they're investing. So only 1/3 of this group would consider themselves impact investors, and we're targeting the other 1/3 who are the early followers into something that can be very meaningful, not just from the financial return, but also by the type of community they represent.
Now, impact investing is where you're trying to invest and make money and do good at the same time.
Yes.
I mean, how much of what you're seeing, in terms of the wealthy families, do they want to do impact investing? How much do they want to do philanthropy? Yes. How much do they still want to do old-style investing?
So there's one quote that I never forgot. Third-generation Swiss investor, and he told me point blank, "You bankers only care about basis points. We families care about real things." So there's definitely from a thought and hard perspective, they not only feel a sense of responsibility, but they know that they need to be part of the solution. So the impetus is there. Also remember, there's the next generation coming on board. So you have the Generation X who is very involved, and then you have their children really pushing in the boards and in the decision making, getting themselves their own allocation of capital to work with towards impact, trying to prove the case and then to bring the whole family across over the impact side.
And one sort of factual question.
Yes, of course.
I mean, how much money are we talking about that's in the hands of these wealthy families?
Yes, so as I mentioned, just the top 10 private asset managers control $10 trillion. And again, for me, it's not just about the capital, it's also about the type of community they represent, because these are the same people who are in the board of private pension funds. These are the same people who are the CEO of companies. So as they get more involved in impact with their capital, what I would hope is that they also get more involved in all their other fields of activity.
And do they find the notion of the Sustainable Development Goals something that is attractive to them, or is it a bit too intangible?
So it is a learning process. I think most of the families deeply care about an issue, and it's a question of having the conversation and seeing how that issue is represented in the Sustainable Development Goals. So definitely it's a framework that we're using. So PwC's role is to standardize the impact information for every deal. So you have deals that are coming from very diverse actors who measure impact differently. But if you're a non-impact investor, you want to know what that means. You want an easy way to understand it. So PwC is working with us to standardize that information. So by standardizing, then they can tag one of their interests and what they care about and what they've invested in philanthropy into something that is related to the Sustainable Development Goals.
And Maya, there was a lot of excitement about the launch of the RISE Fund, partly because you had investors like Bono and Richard Branson and
Jeff Skoll.
Jeff Skoll, Silicon Valley people, But I think for me, the more interesting and exciting thing was that it was a very traditional private equity firm that has traditionally managed tens of billions of dollars, TPG, deciding to actually embrace a very well thought out, I think, approach to impact investing. Why have they done that, and what does that tell us about how we can get the rest of these big traditional financial institutions on board towards the Sustainable Development Goals?
I think there were two primary motivators. One was that for the key team within TPG, it was a moral imperative and it was the right thing to do. That we are in a time where not doing something is tragic and could have tragic consequences. So it was a very deep-seated value system that led to this. The second was that, just looking at the numbers, you are not going to be able to meet the outcomes that we've outlined in the SDGs with just philanthropic capital, with government aid, and with private wealth from individuals. You need institutional commercial capital and the capital markets to come to the table. And this was one way to bring a scaled impact fund to the table, and this was a way to give institutional investors like pension funds an alternative for their investment portfolio, where front and center for pension funds is their fiduciary responsibility to the contributors to those pension funds. They cannot compromise on financial return. They are doing a disservice in their minds to their constituents if they were to consider compromising the discipline around financial return. However, I think the pension funds have also realized that the world is moving to a place where incorporating not just ESG, but thinking about the good that companies do on a commercial basis is a fundamentally good thing. And this provided a product, if you will, for those institutional investors to come to the table and start to put capital into the impact world, which had been very difficult for them to do before because there weren't funds out there that they could pass through their investment committees who said, yes, the impact is important, but we cannot compromise on the financial return element of what we do.
And just, I think you've done 4 investments now.
Yes.
And quite a diverse set of companies.
Right.
Just tell us a bit about, what you're looking for and what makes it a suitable investment for you and what kind of money you're investing.
Absolutely. So we are, first of all, we have built a sector focus, which is the way that TPG does all of its investing. And we've mapped our sectors to the Sustainable Development Goals. So, some of them are quite obvious, like education or healthcare, where, there's really one box almost that you could look at. We are a growth equity fund, so we are in the market to capitalize companies that are really at the growth phase, that can benefit from having a partner at the table who can help them to scale. And the range of investments that we've made has gone up to $120 million, $150 million. So we really are putting capital to work in growth opportunities. A lot of the impact funds are smaller. It's generally only been either development institutions or in some cases mainstream investors who aren't really thinking about mission alignment and the intentionality of impact in their companies, but we really are stepping into that place that hasn't been well served by a mission-aligned investor outside of some of the multilateral institutions.
And one of the things that you're talking a lot about is, I think obviously a long-running issue that many impact investors have been grappling with is how do you measure progress? Yeah. It's easy to measure financial returns, but how do you measure that you're actually moving in the right direction towards the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the fundamental contributions of the RISE Fund is that we've been able to resource against a very deep what I'll call an impact underwriting tool. So this is an approach and a methodology to looking at a company, to looking at the kind of impact that it produces for its customers or beneficiaries based on the products and services that it's providing. We have linked to academic research and evidence. So one of the things that we've been able to do is build almost what I'd call a catalog across the sectors that we invest in of the deep research that has been done by a variety of academics and help inform our investing by actually looking at what products and services have actually produced impact. So we're not doing it on the basis of a tummy rub or an intuition that something might produce impact. We actually want evidence, and we call this evidence-based impact investing. There are a lot of man hours that have gone into the design of our approach and our tool. We did have to build it in such a way that our private equity investing team, which is used to single numbers like investment rate of return, IRR, or return on investment, ROI, we had to come to a quantification and an analytical standpoint for what impact is for each company that we look at. We score it, and then we use that methodology to actually measure over time and help manage greater impact. So by identifying what drives impact, by looking at the outputs and the business drivers that drive impact, we can do a better job of managing to maximize that impact. And when we exit an investment, we can look back and say, at the beginning, what impact did we think we would produce? At the end, did we actually get there? We measure it over time, and did we actually get there? What can we learn from that?
Now, Safeena, you're here representing the social entrepreneur on the ground, actually really helping from the bottom up achieve these goals, particularly with girls, which we all know educating girls is probably one of the best investments that the world can make because of the multiplier of the returns that an educated girl makes so much difference to in so many different ways. And what's particularly interesting, I think, about educated girls is you've recently pioneered the first development impact bond, which is a new form of innovative finance to try and accelerate valuable investments like investing in educating girls. Can you explain a bit about how that works and why you chose that particular route of fundraising?
Yeah. And I think the question of why we chose to go down that route is really fundamental. We're finance ladies, and I don't know that much about finance. So, I can't speak that language. But for me, coming from the ground up, it was, the intentions are slightly different. I see girls every single day who are not in school. I see that they're married off at the age of 10, 12. I've walked into grade 1 classrooms and said, how many girls are married, and seen 5 to 6 hands up, in rural, remote, and tribal areas. My entire career has been in the development sector. I know the ins and outs of the development sector, and I also know there's certain fundamental problems with the nonprofit sector. One of them is that we don't have a clear efficiency indicator. If you're a nonprofit that's very good at fundraising, you will exist for 80 years and you will do really well and you will scale and whatever. But you may not necessarily be creating impact on the ground, right? And it's always worried me. It's like everybody wants scale, but how do we marry scale with impact so that if that girl is, at risk of getting married, we are sure that she will actually be prevented and she will stay in school. So for me, the intention was saying, Educate Girls grew very fast. It's grown in the last, we're not even 10 years old, but we've gone from 50 schools to today we work over 20,000 schools, almost 2 million children. I can't visit 20,000 schools. How do I know that the organization is still creating value add for that last child, that last girl that we reach? Again, the scale requires fuel. It requires funding. So for me, the entire piece, and I'd read about this payment by results, and I was like, oh, if we could just figure out a way to do it, maybe then I could build an organization that had delivering to impact or delivering to outcomes in its DNA. That's the real intention behind it, is I wanted to create a proof of concept where you can tie money to pure outcomes.
So how does it work?
The way it works is the Development Impact Bond, I'm the service provider, so I do the work on the ground. And there's an outcome payer that purchases the impact that I create.
Which is?
Which is 2 indicators. One is enrollment of out-of-school girls, and the second is learning outcomes, which is measured against regular government schools, so there's a counterfactual.
So you have to outperform the government schools.
So you have to outperform, and whatever, let's say I outperform it by 2 units, those are the only 2 units I get paid for, So it's very, very tight in terms of you're only getting paid for the results that you're delivering. It's a 3-year transaction. We've completed 2 years.
So investors come in,
and
they
give me the working capital,
and they get a return based on whether you
return.
achieve those better than the government performances.
Yeah.
And then a charity in this case is funding, is paying the investor if you succeed.
So the charity is not. So I'm still getting a grant.
No, sorry, the foundation.
The outcome payer is paying back the investor, and that's the kind. And everything is independently verified by a third
how much
party.
is the investor going to make if you succeed?
So just based on the 2-year results, which are very strong, if I keep to the same level of performance, my investor should be on track to get about 108% back next year.
So that should obviously be something, if you can get that kind of return, that the capital markets should be rushing for. What do you think needs to happen if you're going to really scale that up and be able to get the whole system working that way rather than just
I think India has an NGO for every 400 people. If every single NGO started to deliver to real results and outcomes, we want to we will accelerate, we will surpass the sustainable development goals if that happened on the ground in terms of performance. And then if there was money that kind of fueled it, and to be able to bring in private wealth, to be able to bring in any investors possible.
And
the biggest bottleneck is really the outcome payers. We need the government, we need tax-paying bodies to really start purchasing this outcome, and which has been slow.
And yet it should be something that the government pays for, because
it's risk-free.
It's the biggest benefit will go to the government in terms of higher tax returns, I guess, because you have girls that eventually can earn a living.
The social returns as well as, it's risk-free. They only pay when the impact has been delivered and verified by a third party. So you'd think governments would be lining up for this. Except I've done 60 government meetings to try and convince them that this would be a great route for them to take.
So why are they so reluctant?
Because they're married to input-based financing.
Which means what?
Which means that you only want to fund based on inputs and outputs. It's teacher training. It's not learning outcomes. And we're saying we've got a template. And it's open source, you can just run with it. So all you need to do is do one pilot with us, and then you'll be ready to do this on your own.
So all 3 of you, as you look at the challenge of actually getting to the Sustainable Development Goals and raising all that extra capital, what's the one thing that you see as the top priority over the next couple of years to sort of attract a lot more of that outcomes-based funding?
For me, it would be the ability to measure and communicate the outcomes in a way that is digestible by the audience we're trying to reach. But we have to develop track record and communicate that track record on impact and make it real and understandable, which is what the industry has been working towards. And I feel that is a critical need.
And is that to attract the attention of the mainstream investors, or is that a different? Who's going to care about?
I would say that everyone should. So governments, for example, I don't know the numbers in the United States, but you think about all of the money that is spent on social programs, and there's lack of information about the benefit of those social programs. So you have political wars about reducing the social programs. If we could actually talk about real benefits being produced, number one, you would fund the programs that are working, and you would have legitimate arguments in society for why these merit those dollars, whether they are taxpayer dollars or commercial dollars. I just think it's critical to be results oriented.
Georgie?
Yeah, for me, it's just a change of mindset. I think for better or worse, the political situation we are right now in the world has opened the conversation, so all the options are on the table. And just like all the options are on the table for what's negative in the world, they're likely there for what's positive. But it requires a total reshifting of the way of our expectations, of how we collaborate, and how we see the world. And just one brief example is one of the deals that we're working with is a solar project, right? Normal, boring, good return, but they've layered over a conservation side of it, so they're preserving the land for rhinos and for elephants. They're providing livelihood for people. So if you use the Sustainable Development Goals as a blueprint for what's possible and try to touch upon all of them as you go on in your conversations, in your discussions, and in your own projects and life, that change of mindset, I think, has a huge potential for breakthrough and scale.
Safeena?
You're doing it.
Yeah, I think we will reach a tipping point at maybe in a few years where we will see more outcome pairs. We will see maybe a lot of people are working on the outcome funds right now. So I'm kind of hopeful, but I think it's still like early days, maybe another 3 to 4 years perhaps. But our hope is really that we'll get to a stage in 5 years where we can work with 5 million children annually, and that there will be this kind of strategic outcomes-based funding available for it.
And do you think, having the private sector involvement, what does that do? Does that raise everyone's game, or does it create distractions from the mission of achieving?
I think it depends on what kind of and what's the intention of that funder coming on board. So, for example, our investor is invested in our success. So they helped us build a performance management system. They helped us build, data systems that can help us kind of see where we're going and be able to respond and course correct, faster. So having a private partner really played a very enabling role. But yes, if the private partner and the investor is trying to hold you by the throat, saying, where's my result, then obviously it's not going to be a very enabling environment. So I think it would depend on each investor and how they play their role well.
And how do you think we change the narrative around, it's not what goes in, it's what comes out in terms of results?
I think that it's an education process. Of course, I think the fact that we have a unifying theory like the UN Sustainable Development Goals is helpful, because if people can galvanize around a common language, that's part of the battle, really. And the vocabulary that we all use in the space is very confusing otherwise. There's also a lot of confusion around financial return, impact, trade-offs, friction, and what you need to develop is a group of people who have experience and judgment to say that there's a spectrum out there, that spectrum is necessary of capital with different return profiles, either purely philanthropic or purely commercial, and that we need skilled people to go out and execute against each of the strategies. And it is a strategy, a set of strategies. There's no one silver bullet that will cure everything, and we all need to work together hand in hand. And at least if we have a common language or a common set of goals like the UN SDGs, that's a huge help.
And when you go and raise money from these titans of finance on Wall Street and the pension funds and so forth, are they starting to get it when you talk about this Sustainable Development Goal
framework?
Yeah,
they are. It was definitely an education process for groups, groups who have not been involved in our space. But I think what they appreciated, number one, was that there was a third-party framework out there that had been broadly accepted. And number two, if it's the United Nations brand on it, if you will, it's meaningful. And you can talk about how it's not just a private sector initiative, it's really all-encompassing, but it is absolutely an education, because most pension fund managers have barely heard of the UN SDGs, even the UN itself. So there's a lot of education, educating to be done, right?
Is that the same with the private families, or not so much?
No, the UN, yes, but they want it vetted.
Yes.
Yes. And that's where Hamilton Lane comes on board, is how do you how you accelerate that gap of trust by having a third-party verifier, so to speak, to rate the co-sponsor that are coming along to share the deals. Yeah.
Now, do we have any questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, gentleman over there.
Can you talk about the preliminary results in your impact bond? What's happened after 2 years?
Sure. We've been able to enroll about 87% of the out-of-school girls. And 54% of them were above the age of 10, which is the much harder to reach group because they're at risk of child marriage, child labor, all kinds, things. So what the bond is really teaching us that we can, and we have strategies to actually crack it at the harder level. And that push came because of the performance management systems and really, that results framework. And on the learning end, we're outperforming regular government schools by between 25 to 30% between Hindi, English, and math. So very, very strong results. And as I said, in terms of the financials, the investor is estimated to recoup around 108% of their money back.
So why do you think non-profits have been so slow to do this kind of performance management system? Like, why has it taken you
naked in terms of your impact? So it's just so much easier to kind of hide behind and not have to do that, to be accountable, to your beneficiary to that level. Everybody will know exactly how well-educated girls performs on the ground at the end of this 3 years. How good are we at the enrollment, at retention, at learning, and at what scale and what cost? So all those three things just become, then you can compare apples to apples.
So where else, do you think there are lots of other areas like education where you could do the similar impact bond model?
Absolutely. I think the measurable one, you can't do it for art and culture and peace and, but I think anywhere, and actually that's the important bit, is that we aligned our outcomes to the SDGs, and we hope that other transactions will do the same so that we don't have a marketplace of bespoke outcomes, which could then, be more aligned for the investor to recoup their money versus really leading to ending poverty or, universal education.
Any more down here? Yeah.
In terms of attempting to apply this to other sectors, such as human rights, are there any attempts that have been made in those less quantifiable outcomes areas?
Yeah.
I don't think that human rights may really be the right outcome for such a transaction. Again, I think the measurable ones will lend themselves much more easily than something like human rights.
If I can add to that, I think that we're moving in that direction. It is much more difficult to do, but I'll make a plug for a piece of work that Matthew works on, which is the social progress imperative, where various aspects of human rights are important in the approach and methodology, and there are very, very smart minds looking at how do you both collect data and then translate that into overall social value. Now, I think what the social impact bonds do, and I've always felt that the social impact bonds are at the tip of the spear because they are absolutely aggressively outcomes focused, number one, and number two, they quantify the outcomes. So the investor puts up money, the investors get paid back, a sense of what is the value, what is the dollar value to society of educating a girl, which is very hard work to do. And I think we are seeing progress towards tackling the more difficult categories like human rights. I haven't heard about arts and culture yet, but human rights, I know we're trying to move.
Certainly, I think one of the things that's happening with measurement of some of these social outcomes is that we're starting to see actually that if you invest in them, they are actually very good investments. So I think the evidence on investing in women, companies that give a much greater role for women is sort of pretty impressive, that actually that's a good investment strategy.
That's right.
And I think we'll see the same with some of these other areas. I want to, up there, yeah, please. A lady on the right there, halfway up. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. My name is Emily Pryor, and I run Data 2X, which is focused on global gender data. And I'm just loving this panel, so interesting, and I'm wondering, you were talking about, having the importance of communicating clearly the results, the data, measuring those outcomes, and this great framework that we have in the SDGs. However, we also know that there's a real dearth of data availability, not only in gender, where there's a huge one, but across the various SDGs. So I'm curious about this from an investment perspective. When you're having to report back, when there's very clear metrics involved, how is the investment community thinking about this, approaching it? Are there investments being made in those underlying data systems? I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
Sure. I'll just give you the Rise Fund's perspective, which is one unit and not everybody's. But we feel that, again, another contribution that we're making with our work is we're identifying where gaps in evidence exist. And what we have thought about is working collaboratively with foundations who have a real sort of mission alignment around advancing certain core interest areas of themselves. And in our conversations with foundations, they've been very excited about the notion of unearthing where the big gaps in evidence are and funding them. And I think it's that kind of collaborative, and that's where uses of capital can be really elegantly applied, where you have philanthropic dollars going towards studying so that we know whether there's efficacy around, a variety of things, some interventions in healthcare, clean cook stoves, certain types of microcredit loans. Are they good, bad, indifferent? Where is the research falling through? Where is it non-existent? Because it also helps you to figure out what can I retool and do better. So I think there is a very strong sidebar here, which is what don't we know, and how can we bring capital sources together to figure out how to calibrate whether doing something will be good or not.
So we're almost out of time. I want to ask each of you to wrap up by really addressing what people in the audience here and people watching can do to help shift finance in the right direction, whether they're people who are running organizations that are trying to achieve the SDGs through their work, but also us as investors, us as consumers. Georgie, why don't you start?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a very mixed audience. So what I would say, there's so much innovation. Keep getting inspired. I think what's beautiful about the Sustainable Development Goals is how much can we learn from each other. So as opposed to staying in a single vertical, what is happening in the other sectors of innovation that could be applied, and that applies to finance, that applies to how we manage. There's a great site called Sustainia. It's out of the Danish government. They have mapped around 4,500 different innovations related to the SDGs. And there, again, you can get very much in tune with what's happening and try to understand it and try to adapt it.
Safeena?
Yeah. So I think I'd like to actually just go back on that because you're so right. For all of these to work, how are you going to exist in environments where data is not so solid? So just to give a practical example, we get paid on enrollment of an out-of-school girl and as per her age, 7, 8 years and plus. But there's no age proof at a village level. And so really at the core of it is for these financial instruments and for investors to have trust, the measurement system is going to become so focused on the measurement system, they will have to be built with a thick layer of empathy around them. That's what we had to do. We had to constantly go back and say it's not going to work because there is no age proof, because the children are born at home. How are we going to do this? And really process alignment, working with all parties together to do it, and really, like I said, it's empathy and really bringing that to the table more, with the finance and with the measurement.
All right.
Like that.
I'll finish quickly. I would say, echoing one of the panels earlier today, just be bold. Figure out where your passion is. Figure out what side of the entire landscape you can play in, and be bold. Time is short. We have one life to live. We want to make this planet better. We want to make our society better, and we are a collaborative effort. So just reach out and figure out what you are best placed to do, and get engaged, get involved.
Great. Well, I think this has been a really stimulating conversation by 3 pioneering leaders in this area. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. Back in your